So it's my pleasure to introduce this session, and I will not read biographies because biographies are all here and you can look them up. I would like to steal a moment to say something about three people actually who are not on the program, but who carry a very important message about what this whole agenda is about, and that is the fact that they fill at the very highest level of scholarship the scholarly dimension of what we're involved in. So I want to mention very briefly three PhD students who are just finishing, or who have just finished, really remarkable dissertations in anthropology and in history. They were all three here at certain points of the day today, but only one of them is left, and I want to introduce Jana Steinova, who is here, just finishing a degree in anthropology with a wonderful dissertation on El Sistema, which you heard about this morning. You heard from Karen about people actually living with the people they study, and this is really part of what anthropologists do. So Jana, in fact, spent a great deal of time living with the people she's studying and is producing really wonderful work. I also want to mention the work of two historians, Adam Sachs, who has just finished a dissertation on the life of Kurt Singer. Kurt Singer was a physician and a social democrat in the 1920s and 30s in Germany. He ultimately died in Theresienstadt in the concentration camp, and in the 1930s formed the organization called the Cultural League of German Jews, who found ways of working and sustaining German and German Jewish musical and other cultures during the early years of the Nazi regime. And one of the first things he did was form a chorus of doctors, a medical chorus, with the double agenda of music and medicine, so music as a dimension of healing. And then there's a related dissertation, this is a pure coincidence, by a young scholar named Jonathan Gentry, also in history, who's written a dissertation on musical modernism, including people such as Strauss and Mahler, as a part of discourse on health, meaning not only music that is good for you, but music that is also bad for you, because the debate over large orchestral music on questionable topics, probably peaking with the premiere of Salome at the turn of the 20th century, was about the danger not only of stories like that, but of music that accompanies those stories. So these are just three very brief vignettes, but since we also educate graduate students here, I think it's important to see how relevant that part of scholarship is to the kinds of things we're talking about today. So today, now we will move on to talk about placemaking and city making. And when we talk about all of these dimensions of the arts here, and obviously in the context of community music works, we try not to lose track that the city of Providence, which may not be on the global list of top 3 or top 5 cities, is an unusually rich and creative place for not only the making of art, but the making of original models for art, and really has been for some time. Providence, as you might say, punches way beyond its weight, not only in the number and quality of artists and art associated with the city, but on the sense of importance of the arts for civic life in the city. And this is true for other locations as well. In no particular order, Prentice, in no order that is necessarily related to the order of proceedings, Prentice, and you'll hear from in a little while, is associated with Arts America, which is, did I get that name right?
Art Place.
Art Place. I knew I was saying something that sounded wrong. Art Place America, that has been particularly generous to the city of Providence in funding multiple projects in town. Prentice is also an actor, and he just confessed to me before that he spent some time as a student in Lagos, not going to the university, but doing other things, which may have been more interesting than studying at the university, so I'll see if he's going to tell you about that. Chloe Klein is an important figure at Community Music Works and has spent time with an organization that has relevance to several people on the panel, Alka Manjati, a string-based educational project in the West Bank, run by really an exceptional figure, Ramzi, who has been in Providence several times and was also a player early in the history of the West Eastern Divan Orchestra, another important project that has a history at Brown as well. Another founding member of that orchestra is Nabil Aboud Ashkar, a violinist and also a physicist, another interesting, or former physicist, another interesting combination. And as you'll see in the program, and as you'll hear, Nabil is the founding director of Polyphony, the Polyphony Foundation based in Nazareth, which is developing a very multifaceted program for original music education, city building, and citizenship building. And finally, Stefano Bloch, who will actually do the chairing of the panel. Stefano was a fellow at the Kogut Center for the Humanities, a postdoc fellow shared between the Kogut Center and Urban Studies for 2 years. He is now in his 3rd year as a diversity postdoc fellow with Urban Studies. And since I had something to do with his first 2 years here, I can say that Stefano was a kind of star of the room with an extremely diverse set of interests. And again, it's the question of how much about you one confesses in public, but he is both a scholar and at some point in his life, a non-scholar in the art of graffiti as an element of the urban landscape on both sides of the establishment, put it that way. So anyway, with that, I'll leave it to Stefano, and we'll go on from there.
And thank you to everyone who's involved in putting this together, but also in doing the work of the room, getting us all seated and videotaped and listened to. And of course, thank you to Michael. I've known him now for 2.5 years. And although I'm not saying this because I'm indebted to him, because I came in through him, but I've watched him over the past 2.5 years be very much an advocate for talking about and doing the work of arts and social action from at every historical period and from every perspective in the contemporary Providence setting. So thank you to him. I will give you a very brief agenda just so you know what we're doing, and we will go from there. Nabil, Chloe, and Prentice are in this order, are going to introduce themselves and their work for a few minutes and allow space for the conversation to then go back and allow them to elaborate on what is interesting to them. But perhaps more importantly, we will have an extended Q&A because we also want to hear what you want to hear from the people up here. So as you're listening, think of things that you want to ask. And if you want to know the answer to that, you're probably going to be able to ask on behalf of 5 other people. So be that spokesperson, be the person with the question. We want to hear from you. So we'll approach it from a kind of a rhizomatic perspective. We'll jump in wherever we see fit, wherever the conversation goes. But I also have questions for them that will get them to think about their work and how their practice speaks to those theoretical issues or political issues that some of us in the academy have as questions and concerns. So we will do that, and we will start here.
Thank you. Well, I was trying to think about what is the best. Oh, first of all, Nabil Aboud Ashkar. I come from Nazareth, the largest Arab-Palestinian city in Israel. It's located in the Galilee, and I'm sure each one of you can think of another person coming from that city.
He wasn't born there.
He wasn't born there, but he came from, I was born there, yes. And on the same day. It happens, yes. I was worried when I was 34, but it passed. Everything was okay. I'm a bit older now. I was thinking what would be the best way to introduce Polyphony and the work we're doing. And I will start by a story. It might seem irrelevant at the beginning, but please bear with me. Hopefully it will sound relevant by the end of the story. When I was in Bruges last time, and Bruges is known for its beautiful canals and all the endless canals throughout the whole city, I noticed how many beautiful swans, white swans, are in the water. And some of the locals told me a quite ridiculous but funny story, that a few years back, a couple of black swans came into those canals, and that disturbed the whole city, to the point that the city councils had to discuss this in their meeting and decided to remove the black swans. In a way, I like to think of Polyphony as a story of a black swan, but with a better ending. And to explain, when I was a child, and I was born to an unusual family that thought classical music was very important. And both my brother and I have learned to play instruments. My brother is a pianist, and I learned to play the violin. At that time, there were maybe 3 or 4 families in Nazareth that were aware about classical music and bothered to teach their children. My family was in a way more passionate or obsessed about it, and we both ended up taking classical music on the academic and professional level. And that was basically the beginning of Polyphony. Now, I will not talk more about Polyphony. I'll show a 5 minutes video which will show what this very small beginning, this first black swan became into. And now the technology part.
Hello, I'm Renee Fleming, and I want to invite you to take a few moments to learn about Polyphony. This groundbreaking organization is using classical music to build bridges and foster peace between Arab and Jewish communities throughout Israel.
As an Arab living in Nazareth, surrounded by Jewish cities, I don't have much relationship with them. It's something weird if you have a relationship. When I think about Jairus and Maria as young people, I feel sorry. Without Polyphony, he cannot meet Jews that have the same interest as he had.
אנחנו גרים בקיבוץ כברי. סביבנו יש את שייח' דנון, כפר יאסיף, ירכא, מעיליא ועוד הרבה מאוד כפרים שהמפגש איתם הוא בדרך כלל במרכז הקניות. מעבר לזה אין הרבה קשרים לצערי הרב מאוד. בלי הפעילות של פוליפוני לא היה מזדמן לא להדס ולא לנו לפגוש ולהכיר שכנים שלנו.
אנחנו מכירים בעצם בערך כבר שנתיים, דרך פוליפוני שאיחד בינינו כדי שננגן ברביעייה, שטסנו איתה לחו"ל.
אצל רוב החברים שלי ובחברה שלנו זה יוצא דופן שמישהו יש לו חבר יהודי.
המוזיקה נותנת לי שפה מאוד מאוד מיוחדת ומשותפת, שאני יכול לדבר איתה עם כל אדם.
בעצם בדרך המוזיקה הכרתי את הזז והחברה היהודית יותר טוב ממה שהייתי מכיר אותה.
Polyphony educates its young musicians about the role of music and the arts and encourages them to play an active role in shaping a more harmonious Israeli society.
אני חושב שמאוד מאוד חשוב להכיר את החברה הערבית ואת כל התרבות הזאת, כי אנחנו חיים אחד ליד השני בעצם. אנחנו לא כאלה שונים ואנחנו לא צריכים להיות שנואים אחד על השני. אנחנו בדיוק אותו דבר, אנחנו חושבים על אותו דבר, אנחנו באים לעשות אותו דבר, וזה רק הבדל של דת או שפה.
הפעילות בפלופוני נותנת לי אופטימיות והרגשה שאפשר לחיות ביחד.
The commitment between the parents from the Arab and Jewish sides, not only to bring their children to our programs, but also to stay in touch and do any effort they can to communicate better and understand each other better.
דרך הפרויקט הזה שהדס שותף לו וחלק ממנו, מכירים, מתחברים, ונצרת שהיא עיר ערבית הופכת להיות כמעט בית שלי שלנו.
I think of the future, I see sometimes darkness, but at the same time I see hope. We need to strengthen the hope. Polyphony is a one way to do that.
And now we'll hear from...
In the book, The Inner Voice, you say, fostering the creativity and joy.
So my name is Chloe Klein. I'm the Education Director for Community Music Works. Thank you all for being here. So I wanted to talk today a little bit about one particular aspect of our performance practice that we've been working recently to deepen with the support of art groups. Thank you very much. But a little context first. Community Music Works, as I think probably everybody knows, is an organization that's built around musicians in residence in a community. So place is central to our work and has been from the beginning for the past 19 years. The model is unusual in that we have musicians who are both teachers and performers, and that we see in the ideal world that those are mutually reinforcing instead of taking away from each other. We talked this morning about art as ideal, and that's certainly a difficult ideal to strive for, and I think my colleagues will back me up that we don't always get there, but we hope that the teaching and the performing are mutually reinforcing and that they come together to create a stronger community than just doing one or the other. In both realms, in performance and teaching, we think a lot about the impact that we can have on the community and the impact that the community has on us as musicians. That's central to our mission statement, which is to create cohesive urban community through music education and performance that transforms the lives of students, families, and musicians. As teachers, that transformation, that impact has been somewhat clearer, I would say, to us over the past 10 years. Denny Wolf is here and did a wonderful evaluation project with us in 2008 and 2009 on the transformation that occurs with our students over time, our highly engaged students over time. And we see that as teachers, with the teaching relationships are built around long-term mentoring relationships. So we see the changes in our students. We work with our teens especially to think explicitly about what it means to be a musician and a citizen and a member of a community, and how their musicianship can impact community. But we've been thinking recently more about how our performances can have an impact in the community. It's not a new strand by any means, but it's something that we've been working on and thinking a lot about recently. And I want to talk a little bit about a concert series that we did this past fall in a taqueria in Olneyville. Some of you may have come to some of these concerts at La Lupita, which is a wonderful taqueria that we were very experienced with as patrons before performing there. And also performed there occasionally with pop-up concerts. But we worked with La Lupita and with some other neighborhood partners to build a series of 4 concerts throughout the fall. Sebastian talked this morning about thinking of community art or art in general as having social implications that could be related to context or content. And in this particular series, we were thinking specifically about context, so taking very traditional classical music, but bringing it to a place where it would not traditionally be played. We think of it as the juxtaposition of neon and Haydn, which is a wonderful comment somebody made on a survey we did there. Thinking about how can we make this music come alive in this particular space? And I think it's important to note that when we think about building these I've been calling them recently community-centric concerts. When we think about building these, we start from a place of building on community strengths. Where are places in the community that people already gather, that are already very vital places? Our teaching work also grew up that way around the West End Community Center. And the performance work, we found that to be equally important, to find spaces that already are places where the culture of the neighborhood comes together in interesting ways. So one of the central questions around performance that we have been asking ourselves for many years is, can these community performances strengthen community? And that's a pretty, that can mean a lot of things, strengthening community. So as we sat and thought about these concerts over the fall, we decided to look specifically at certain things within these concerts. And we used this fall as a sort of lab. We did a series of surveys of the people who came to the concerts and followed them up with interviews. Marie Chieri, I think, is in the audience. She did some wonderful cognitive mapping with audience members at these concerts. And we also did a larger survey at the end of the concerts of our entire mailing list to try to understand if what we were learning from the Lalupita concerts could also be translated across the wider performance arc that we do. So we were looking at whether concerts in the community that are thoughtfully designed around community strengths can change perceptions and assumptions about a specific neighborhood, whether these concerts can break down barriers to mobility, helping people travel to places either within their neighborhood or outside their neighborhood that they might not have otherwise ventured to. Whether these concerts can spark a greater participation in or utilization of neighborhood services, whether those are restaurants or health services or other things. Whether these concerts can sort of spark a greater sense of engagement with the neighborhood, both among residents and non-residents. And most importantly, on many levels, but certainly for what I'll talk about today, whether these concerts could create a stronger sense of social cohesion. I think if we think back to this morning and the central role of art as helping us encounter the other, that this idea of social cohesion is pretty central to that. Can you use art as a space where people can come together with people that they don't know, people from different backgrounds, from different cultures, and together encounter a work of art and learn something about themselves and about their neighbors that they didn't already know. So the results were pretty fascinating, and I won't go into all the numbers because that would take a lot of time and bore everybody to tears. But we did learn a lot from the Lalupita series about a sense of connection growing over the 4 concerts, which was really interesting to us. The last concert, which was in December, the people surveyed, about 60% of the people surveyed had not previously been to a Community Music Works event. But, make sure I get the right number here, something like 86% of them said that they felt a connection to other people in the room. And I think of the people who felt a connection, 43% of those said that it was a very strong connection. And people talked about connection to feelings that were expressed through music, connecting to the peacefulness around the room, meeting new people, talking to people at their table that they didn't know, making friends with new people, and singing and participating in the concert together. And I won't go too much further than that, but in the follow-up survey that we did to the entire CMW mailing list, we learned that this effect sort of deepens and strengthens over time, so that the longer somebody is engaged with community music works, or the more deep that engagement becomes, the more likely they are to say that they have a strong connection with people from different cultures and backgrounds through community music works. So it's exciting and has a lot of implications for our continuing work in this area, and happy to take more questions about that.
Absolutely. Francis?
Thanks, Stefano. Thanks, Michael and Sebastian, for having me. Great to be here. Thank you all for coming. As Michael said, when I was an undergrad, I misbehaved and played hooky from the University of Lagos, and instead would hang out, I think, for 5 days a week, 5 hours a day, at the annex of the National Theater, learning traditional drumming. But don't tell my parents. So I am part of the Art Place team, and Art Place is a 10-year project of 16 foundations, 8 federal agencies, and 6 financial institutions. And they're all focused on how arts and culture can strengthen the social, physical, and economic fabric of communities. Our goal is that when a mayor, a head of a CDC, seats a conversation about the future of her community, arts and culture is at that table alongside sectors like transportation, housing, public health, and that each of those representatives at the table is from a sector that merits intentional investment, and that each can also be seen as a potential contributor to the goals of the others who are at the table. And so we approach that mission through 4 primary lines of work. One is our National Creative Placemaking Fund, which is our primary grant-making function. And since 2011, we've supported 227 projects in 42 states, and of communities of all sizes. And the grants typically average right around $300,000. And usually that's tackling a challenge or opportunity within communities. We've complemented that recently with our community development investments, and that's an opportunity for us to engage over a 3-year period up to $3 million with 6 organizations, where we're going on the project-based journey with them of how arts and culture can play into their place-based mandate, but then also the org change journey of incorporating arts and culture into the work that they do. We selected 6 place-based organizations from around the country that have no significant history of incorporating the arts into their work, and are excited to go on those dual journeys with them. The 3rd line of work that we do is research. So we are engaged with all of this phenomenal experiential practice that's happening across the country, but to what end unless we're able to take our exposure to that kind of work and then to learn the lessons from it, package it in a way that's of use to people who want to continue it. And then finally, there's field building, which is my specific charge. We are going to sunset in 2020. What is the impact that we would like to have between now and then? What's the legacy that we want to leave? How can we support the people who are doing this work? How can we open doors for them? And then how can we shift normative expectations ultimately so that arts and culture is expected to be at that table? And our work primarily falls under the banner of creative placemaking. And typically we say there are 4 questions that one should ask of a creative placemaking project. First, what is the geographic community? So we insist on community being defined by geography. Draw a circle on a map. Second, what is the desired community change? What is it that the people who live, work, play within that circle on a map would like to take on? Third, how can the arts contribute to that change? What is the artistic intervention that's going to tackle that challenge or opportunity? And then 4, how will you know that change is happening? And that's not a send in the consultants move. That's about how will you know when you should throw in the towel and say you've accomplished your goal and that your time would be better spent elsewhere. And so it's that piece of having some sense of what success should look like from the beginning, and then also taking a look back and being able to tell the story of what happened. And as Michael said, we are excited about all of the great work that's been happening here in Providence. Community Music Works, we've invested in them. Also Waterfire, and then the City of Providence for some of the work that they're doing around public safety in Trinity Square and Grace Church Cemetery.
Thank you. You know, what Nabil, Chloe, and Prentice, and others who have excuse me, spoken about today is so interesting for how they each acknowledge that the neighborhood or the community is an unfinished product. And that's one of the things that in academia, at least, we try to convey to our students, that cities and locations are physical manifestations of always changing ideologies and creativity and worldviews, forms of existence, use values, exchange values. The places are never done. And everyone who's spoken today acknowledges that. And the way they've acknowledged that is by discussing how they have each, with their organizations or themselves, brought art into the community as part of contributing to that unfinished product that communities are. So that communities are flexible to welcome in that art. And each of these organizations has a spatial or geographic metaphor in the title. So you have Art Place America, you have Community Music Works, and I'll play off the term foundation, but Polyphony Foundation, for me at least as a geographer, the idea of foundation is the starting point, the physical starting point of what this thing is going to do. But the question I have for each of you is, as much as the community isn't a finished product and therefore can be affected by or transformed in very positive ways by art, art is also not a finished product. Paul Geyer earlier today in the session on aesthetic education and social imagination, as well as Sebastian, talked about how always trying to refine and get to that aesthetic purity, that perfect space that art could be, and you're always coming up against it, but it's always eluding you. Art is never finished. So if we also know that, like communities, art is never finished, what I want to hear from each of you is, how has the community or the geographic setting in which you're all based, and for you it's many locations, how has that come back to inform how you understand or produce or perform art? Each of you, I assume, went into these locations knowing art to some degree, knowing how to perform it or practice it, knowing the language of art. You came in with this somewhat finished product. I want to know how the location came back to change that for you.
I'll jump in. I think the location has been really central. I'll talk again about the La Lupita concerts as one example. Several years ago, it must be like 6 or 7 years ago, I remember doing a pop-up concert in La Lupita. We had a chamber music piece that we were working on. I want to say Mendelssohn, but I don't really remember. And we were just looking as musicians for a way to play through the piece and give it a run through. And so we went into La Lupita, and they were happy to have us, and we set up and we played, and we played through it and had some tacos and left. And the challenge that we've given ourselves in the more recent concerts that we've done in La Lupita specifically, but in other community locations, is just that, to think about how does this piece of art change in this specific location, and how do we help translate this piece to the people who are coming in off the street to get some tacos and did not expect to see a string quartet playing in the corner of La Lupita. And the thinking you have to do about the piece of music, I think, in order to find entry points for people who are not familiar with it, I think I can speak for my colleagues, I think profoundly changes that music and the way you perform it, and the way you may perform it the next week in a more traditional setting. The other thing I would say is that the youth who were at the La Lupita concerts, and the youth participation and the audience participation factors of those concerts, and a lot of people commented on that in the surveys and evaluations. But for musicians as well, to have kids who are not in the program, but who maybe came with other kids in the program, and to have families who are not familiar with this music really engaging and participating in the music, learning a complicated rhythm and clapping it along with you, and then recognizing it as you play it, is, I think, one of the most, I mean, it's rewarding beyond what I generally feel in a more traditional classical setting, and it changes the way I feel about the music that I'm playing.
I think our program is still too young to get to the point where the community is changing the music. We still have a long way that the music is changing still the community until to get to the to the stage where it's mutual. I can tell you in the very beginning, to bring classical music into the Arab community, which is a foreign culture and brings with it a set of approaches and disciplines that don't exist in the Arab music, where classical music is very precise, it's all written down, and you need to basically understand the text and be committed to perform what is written on the highest precision. And the interpretation only comes after that. And this is something which it has its certain balance between your intellect, your mind, and your heart, which I think is very unique to classical music. Well, maybe I can say in the beginning, our influence on the music, that it was out of tune. It took us a while to play it more in tune, so it was maybe unique to us that in the first couple of years it was out of tune. But even for a young Arab kid to believe that he can play the violin in tune was not only a matter of the know-how and matter of practice, it's a matter of believing that it's possible. And to me, that was maybe one of the most fascinating things. Once we had the first generation of students who were able to play in tune and started winning competitions in Tel Aviv and other places, I didn't have to convince the second generation that they can play in tune. It was understood. So we are constantly in the process of refining our understanding and our ability of the music. Given how complicated classical music is, I think it's going to take longer time for this process to get to the other way where our students have suddenly a very unique understanding of classical music that hasn't been approached before. What is also interesting, and this relates to what you just said, even the same musical work, whether it's a quartet or a symphony, it somehow has a different meaning performed in a different venue in front of different audience, even if it's the same orchestra. And the space does have its input on the experience. So it's definitely a more emotional experience when you have Arab and Jewish people coming from all over Israel to Nazareth and sit in the concert hall to listen to, I don't know, Haydn trumpet concerto or Mozart French horn concerto. So that does have its own element, its own charm to it.
This question makes me think of a colleague of ours, Michael Rode, who runs the Center for Performance and Civic Practice, which recently relocated to Arizona State University. And he has this spectrum, the three types of creative practice. There's studio practice, where the artist has their intention, they do their work, they create a product, and it's within the studio, and it's a closed room largely. There's social practice, where the artist has an intention, and then it plays out in the social or public sphere. And then there's civic practice, where the artist is functioning as a conduit for the community's or the public's desires, the community or public's intentions. And it's not to say that one type of practice is better or one way of practicing is superior to the other, but our work is attempting to open up doors for those who are interested in social practice and civic practice Because what we've found is that creatives have a tremendous ability to grasp the multiple truths of some of the most vexing issues within communities in a way that many other people simply don't, that people of many other walks of life simply don't. And it's by creatives and artists coming in and functioning as that conduit that we've been able to see tremendous work happening across the country.
You know, for each of you, I'm sure you've put so many hours into your art. You know, hours of practice, whether it be drama or playing instruments. And there's so much work that goes into putting on a performance or creating an art space in which to do drama or create any kind of art. But I'm thinking about the other part of your work. And this goes under the heading of artists doing political and community-based work. So Daniel Hewitt is a critic at RISD right down the hill. And he makes the point that doing art is 90% fixing mistakes. And only really 10% of actually producing something or finishing something. So most of art is the work of art, not the finishing of the product of art. So in your own work, aside from or in addition to the countless hours of perfecting a product, what percentage of doing community-based art is making something, is contributing to all that goes into building the frame within which art is produced? Maybe some specific examples of what most of your time is dedicated to in being someone who's political and community oriented, in addition to art practice. I know it takes up a lot of your time, so I know there's stories about what you do. What's on your mind? It could be what's on your mind as well.
Yeah, at times I wish that I spent a hell of a lot less time in Outlook and more time making cool things, just to be frank. Mm-hmm. But I think, at least in my position, as an artist in an organization that has this 30,000-foot position or role that we're fortunate enough to be able to play in this limited period of time, a lot of it, I think at first, was about the rallying cry of creative placemaking, showcasing that this work is out there doing something that is incredible. And the moment that we are coming to now is considering what is going to be necessary to sustain that momentum beyond 2020. And what I focused on in my first year and a half or so on the job was communications infrastructure, systems, etc. And I think now we're at the point where there's tremendous adoption from such influential players that have the potential to be long-standing partners in this work, that the work is now about coordination and dividing and conquering, making sure that we take this moment where there is so much attention on this suite of practices and leverage it to the best of our ability and promote efficiency in it. And so a lot of my work, at least at this point, is about coordination, which I would say likely is analogous to what happens when you are on the ground in a project, where you manage to get things green lighted and then it comes time to do the work. And it's about coordinating all of those relationships that you did the great work of cultivating in order to get toward whatever that finish line looks like.
I would like to add that for me as a violinist by training, regardless of any social agenda that music can impact and influence, the minute the musicians are on stage or in the rehearsing space, the experience is 100% about the music, because music deserves to stand on its own, first of all. But also, once it becomes about something else, it loses a lot of its content. But to get to that point and to bring the right people into that place where they can come and rehearse and not worry about other things, it takes a lot of coordination, it takes a lot of work. And in our case, just for example, the first time we wanted to bring young Arab and Jewish kids to rehearse together to come to Nazareth. So the minute they were in the same space and rehearsing, it was seemed like a normal, a young orchestra or ensemble rehearsal. The amount of work we had to do just to raise awareness and convince young musicians from Tel Aviv to come to Nazareth was enormous. It was a large number of hours of meeting, of just making people feel comfortable to come to Nazareth. Young Jewish people never came to Nazareth before, and definitely not stay overnight and just to stay and rehearse and live there. So, but for me the important thing is, regardless of all these difficult, time-consuming, sometimes frustrating challenges that reality presents, the process of rehearsing is purely about music. And just to give an example of how much that's consuming out of my time, I gave up the idea of practicing already a while ago, but I also at some point started lending my own instruments to the students who were doing competitions and were progressing well. Just a few weeks back, I just felt for it. I had a half an hour, and I thought, I want to play something. And I went into my room, and I didn't find even a violin in my room. So I apparently gave up all my violins and bows, and I didn't even notice that. So this gives you an idea of how much running an organization is time-consuming and taking me personally away from my own music.
I'm with you on that practice time. I'm not totally sure I understood the question completely. I'm not sure if you were making a distinction between the preparation for art that is politically oriented versus art that is for art's sake. Were you making that distinction?
No, we could put it even in more practical terms. What consumes most of your time in terms of making this thing happen, reaching your goals, that isn't direct music practice, but all of that work that goes into making this happen, the logistics, the bureaucracy, or even the creative process that's away from the instrument.
Right. So I guess I would pick up on things that both of you said. Nabil, I would agree that whatever the focus of the art is, the first priority has to be the quality of the art itself. So that I think it's always a struggle to balance, but I think we do the best we can to make sure that the quality that we're bringing, the art that we're bringing is of the highest possible quality, no matter where it's going. Because I think that in itself is a political statement, right? That the art we take to Olneyville needs to be of the same quality as the art we take anywhere else. And then I would also pick up on what you were saying about partnerships, building partnerships, that has been a lot of the work, and some of my colleagues can speak to this more than I can, but I know that to build the partnerships that supported these community concerts was a lot of heavy lifting, and I think we learned a lot in the process about primarily how to communicate what the benefits are more effectively, more quickly, because I think it takes a lot of time just to sort of convince or for partners to understand each other's strengths and to figure out how they can best work together. I think that was one thing also that we learned from this evaluation, was that we need to do better at figuring out how to communicate very quickly what the benefit is for the partner in this project. But I think that's a huge piece of the work, is just building the partnerships in the community that will support the work.
Yeah. Earlier today, I think it was Karen Zorn who made the point about usually we have to convince people about the importance of our work, but in this crowd, I don't need to do that. And based on at least two of your answers right now, it makes me think of my aunt. She was a first chair clarinetist for the LA Philharmonic for 56 years up until, I think, about 12 days ago. And over the years, she would say, oh, we're going, under Dudamel, we're going to Venezuela, or under Zubin Mehta, we're going off to Tel Aviv, or under, I think it was Esa Pekasana, we're going over to China, and in the stories, right around 1990, we're going to the Czech Republic, which is now called the Czech Republic. going all over the world. And I said to her, I said, wow, how interesting that the work you're doing is so political, and you're really getting in there and putting music where political ruptures are taking place. And her answer was exactly like yours, actually. She said, no, it's just about the music. And by the way, I stopped practicing in 1987. But she said, it's just about the music. So going back to that comment, I think it was by either Karen or Heidi saying, we don't need to convince anyone here. Do you think there's an aspect where the musicians maybe do need to be convinced that what they're doing is highly political and contributing to community change? And in fact, with all due respect, I want to hear you reflect on this, it's not just about the music, but you're actually doing something profound off the page and away from the instrument. Do you think there's some convincing that needs to be done here?
I think if you have an Arab and Jewish musicians that decide to come and play a piece by Mozart together, that's already a statement they're making.
Mm-hmm.
So just by doing that act, they're already making a difference and creating new voice in the community that did not exist before. So music does give them that possibility and that platform to make that voice heard. But I differentiate between that thing and that the minute they sit on the stage and they perform. You cannot play a Mozart piece that it would sound like it supports democracy and play it in a different way that it's anti-democracy, or it just doesn't exist. Mozart, it's a combination of sounds that make certain logical phrase that you relate to, and you choose a specific way as a person how to express it, where you want to have more crescendo on this. When I think about music, this is what comes to my mind. Crescendo, diminuendo, the harmonic tension, different colors of sound, and those breathtaking moments. I don't think about this is civil society and this is the rights, this bar is the rights of the minorities, and it's not. But
that's my job.
But the fact that people agree and willingly and make that effort to come together to perform together, the fact that the young Jewish musician is coming to Nazareth and staying for 4 days and feeling comfortable there is already a big statement. And for me, it's also an interesting idea, and we're constantly exploring. How can you have a bigger influence than just saying we're coming together? I don't have the answer yet, but that's already an important step.
Prentice, it sounds like working in multiple sites with multiple organizations, you probably, correct me if I'm wrong, deal with multiple artists, and I mean artists in a broad sense. Do you find yourself entering into these conversations or thinking about how to, I'm going to use broad term or provocative terms here, but convincing the artists that what they're doing is political engagement? Do you find yourself wanting the artist to acknowledge that because you believe it to be true? Or can the artist say this is not about politics, even though the outcome may very well be?
It's a difficult question because it brings into question what the value add is of the artist in a given situation. All artists do not need to be convinced that their work is political. Mm-hmm. And that's regardless of whether the context in which they are practicing their art is political. So maybe it's that an administrator needs some convincing to understand the broader impact that their work could have, because it might open up new opportunity for that organization should they choose to take that path. But from my perspective, I have little interest in convincing. If anything, I would say that the convincing needs to be done on the demand side as opposed to the supply side. Looking at the external organizations who might not be looking to the artist for the value that they could add to a politically contentious situation, and championing that value. And for the artist, I'm happy with them continuing to do what they do well.
I think in our case, it's the artists responsibility also once he has decided to come and play with another artist from the other community.
Can you bring the mic closer?
Yes, sorry. Then it's the artist's responsibility to get to know the other better and to understand the differences and understand the other narrative, the narrative of the other, and gradually with those repeating opportunities to come together, try to maybe accept it, maybe agree with some of it, and also explain your own point of view. So there is a difference between a joint venture where you bring Arab and Jewish musicians and they just come, play together, shake hands, say wonderful, and go back to their homes, or they make that effort to get to know the other and to understand the way they think and why they think that way. So that we do urge our musicians to do. But taking that from that level to making it something that's more public, making a more political statement, we don't try to do that. I think just coming together is, in our part of the world, is already a big statement.
Stefano, can I jump in?
Yes.
So, since you invited the Q&A to begin early, I'm just going to lead by example. I think one of the questions I would love to hear you guys pull apart a little more is, we have this thing in common, Community Music Works and Polyphony, that we're dealing with performing art music, right? That's its own kind of discipline and its own set of issues. But I think at Community Music Works, we've spent a lot of time thinking about that effect of bringing people together as, like Chloe referenced, a core community concern. You know, in this neighborhood of Olneyville, it's one of the listed 5 priorities of the community plan is we don't know each other. There's no social cohesion. And with, you know, I tried to make that distinction this morning between like explicitly political action through art versus situational conditions. Like, we're situated here, that's the action. And, you know, when Art Place is saying, like, what's the geographic scope, what's the community issue? Well, if the community issue is bringing people together, it's actually quite ephemeral. Like, it happens, it goes away. We just did the Mozart, the people left Nazareth, it's gone. So it's a difficult thing, and that's what Chloe's been trying to measure, is like, well, what's that lasting social impact? I think we need to talk more about that. I mean, I think, Stefano, you're trying to push people to say it's political. You know, whether or not we say that's an intentionally political action, I think that bringing people together to find some sense of cohesiveness, to know their neighbor or the person from another part of the city that they, you know, have no commonality with, that's a hard project. I wonder if you would just dig into it a little more.
Well, it is, and we know, and we've seen over the last 4 years that Polyphony had been trying to do that. How can you measure that? I don't know. But I can see that the difference between the first time we brought a group of young musicians together, I can tell you of my experience. The first time I had a quartet of 2 Arab and 2 Jewish musicians in the room and I was coaching them, I didn't feel comfortable myself. And it felt very strange.
And how long did it take to break that down?
5 minutes. The minute I started to shout at them about how to start the sound from to put the bow on the string, and then it felt right. The minute I knew I had to tell equally each one of them what to do, and it became more. It just felt like another rehearsal. But I can tell you before and that this very first seconds were very very strange, and also in between the musicians. What I can see that it really didn't take too long for this concept, also for Jewish young musicians, to think that there are Arab peers that play as well as they do and they can come together. This needed a lot of changing many stereotypes and wrong perception of the other. And I can tell you a story. We had a visit at some point at the conservatory, very important lady from England, Dame Vivian DeField, who runs a very big foundation, Clore Foundation. And she heard about the conservatory in Nazareth from the principal violin of the Berlin-Phil. She was in a festival in Salzburg. She was talking to him about classical music in Israel, and he told her the best violinists in the country today are in Nazareth. She was what? So she she decided to come and to see for herself. And after she heard our students, and she was very moved, she came to me and said, I would love to do something to help build a young orchestra that bring Arab and Jewish kids together. But I know it's impossible. And I said, why do you think it's impossible? He said, because I know that Jewish kids don't want to play with Arab kids. I said, I think I know the reason why. Because they don't know how good our students are. And I was right. Because if you make sure that both groups are equally able to express themselves through their instruments, the minute you bring them together, they immediately have this channel of communication. If there are major differences in their abilities, then you don't have a conversation there. And this is why the first time we brought young Jewish musicians to Nazareth, after big effort, we were able to bring 8. And not on the high level. They were very interested and very receptive of the idea, but they were not the best young musicians. The second time, after people started just hearing about how good our students are, we had 15 musicians and they were already better. The third time, we had an orchestra of 50 young musicians, half Arab, half Jewish, really of the finest young musicians in the country. So, big part of that was not realizing that in the other community there are good musicians that could play at least as good.
Where are we with time? We're good. I think we could do much more Q&A. One way I want to frame that is, because this session is called Placemaking and City Making, I see it as very, very political. The process of city making is not apolitical or value-free. And I mean political in many senses of the word. I think Flea is the basis for the Red Hot Chili Peppers, and he, along with the lead singer, Anthony Kiedis, started the Silver Lake Conservatory of Music in a traditionally Latino, Chicana neighborhood in Los Angeles. And one of the goals that Flea has articulated to me and others is that we want this conservatory to train local residents, young people, in the classical sense, in jazz, in rock. We want to train them, which is maybe to some degree professional, apolitical. But his project, he says, is about getting young people to walk down the street with their instruments and cases, and to meet each other on the street, and to sit on the grass, and to have coffee. We want their identities to be about the music. And in a neighborhood that's been traditionally, very much affected by gang violence, we see the music as being political, not because music is a force that stops gang violence, but music allows people to engage on some other level. And one of the things that he wants to do is he's been trying to buy the local property on the corner away from investors who want to put in a mixed-use condo development. He wants to, above market value, buy that property to put in a park. And he says the reason we want the park is because we want the conservatory to spread out into the neighborhood, and in the form of people interacting in a park space, again, with their instruments closed in cases, because that's what we're doing too. So this is what I mean by it being a very profound political movement. These organizations are, even when the actual making of the art can be seen as apolitical. So, questions for them? I can do it. Right, in the front.
It's almost more of a comment. I've agreed with everything that you said and understood it all, and you yourself just said you use the word political in many ways. I think the use of the word political is being used here to mean also sort of society building or community building. And political, the word itself, especially right now in this country in an election cycle, is a very loaded word. And very often what I found myself doing was parsing each comment, figuring out what they actually meant by the word political when they were using it in there. So maybe we can find a different word to use, or at least be explicit about how we're using the word in this sentence, because it means so many different things. And most of the things that we're talking about here, we haven't started talking about votes or whether the king is deciding that there's going to be music or not, or the things that we really nail into what we call the political process. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the social processes that affect whatever broader political processes going on in this country or in Venezuela or somewhere else. But we're not really talking about the politics as I understand it. It's just making it a little harder for me to, I have to work harder to understand what you're saying. I'm getting it, but it's just a comment that word seems to be a bit of a stumbling block, at least for me.
I could say when Providence calls itself the cultural capital, one of the pushback on that is what a political statement to suggest that culture can be cultivated through professional practice. That's a political statement. So there's actually political pushback, and political in the sense of these entities or this form of art is going to transform society. That's a political question. So in that sense, so you're right to be confused by how broad the term is, because the term is much broader than election cycles and voting and democracy. It means so much more than that.
Hey there. So this was such a great day, and there was so much about breaking down walls with young kids, kind of successfully broadening their minds. One thing I was thinking, because I did a classical music education, and one thing that I noticed with my colleagues is that there is actually a lot of prejudice within that scene itself already. Like, for instance, many of my friends think that classical music is very superior to other styles, but that's just an example. So I was almost thinking, and this goes actually for any of the projects, is there a way to kind of educate back the people that, our governments or people in our colleges, because apparently it works very well for the kids, but then I feel that here we're a very select kind of maybe idealistic group, and I wish that almost that my Facebook friends or something would share the same opinions. Maybe is that something you can...
You can imagine what they thought about me when I brought classical music to Nazareth.
Well, yours is even more complicated because it's classical, so that I cannot even imagine, because I can imagine it's almost like a hostile...
Well, one of the ways we dealt with is we understood at the very beginning that to train 100, 150 or 200 students to play an instrument on a high level is not going to make the change in the community or in the society on the grassroots level. And this is why we developed a program that educates young people to appreciate classical music, and not just classical music, but any refined music or artistic music. And that program grew up very fast. We started with 3 schools in Nazareth, where at that point there was absolutely no effort to teach music any way in the Arab schools.
Mm.
We had to hire the teachers, train them ourselves, develop the curriculum, and we believed it's essential to expose the young students to a live concert. So the whole process was basically preparing the teachers to prepare the students so that eventually they can sit in concert hall and know how to listen and how to behave. And the results were so clear and powerful that within 3 years this program has grown to reach out to over 12,000 students all over the country within 3 years. and was adopted by the Ministry of Education, which is on itself is a, well, I think since Jesus' time until now there was no miracles in Nazareth. Maybe it was one of them to get the Israeli government to adopt a music appreciation program in Arab schools. But really, the headmasters and the teachers saw the effect of the music on the students, and they could feel it in the classroom and the breaks and so on. So one should be very thoughtful of the different processes that needs to be addressed. So it's not enough just, and when I talked in the beginning about the black swan, and this is something I thought a lot about, and my parents and my family, they were very worried that if my brother and I became good musicians, we will leave Nazareth and not come back because there's no appreciation of what we do in our own hometown. And we were very aware of their fear, and this is why, from the very beginning of founding Polyphony, we knew we had to work on two different levels to produce the highest level of talents that could study in the best schools around the world and win competitions, but at the same time develop a large group of people within our community that would appreciate them, so that they will, even if they leave, they will still have this strong connection with their own community. So it goes both ways, I think.
Thank you.
To look at that quickly from the other angle too, I think one of the ways that we challenge ourselves as classical musicians is to stretch our own learning to other genres. And I think one of the most meaningful and successful concerts we've had in recent years was a commission of a Venezuelan composer, a piece called Fantasia. I'm forgetting the rest of it, but it has to do with the guava. It's really cool. But we played with a salsa band. A lot of our students learned this piece and performed it with us. It was performed in a concert gym, and to stretch ourselves as classical musicians in that way, to learn a new language and vocabulary, and to have our students see us learning in that way, I think was a really important acknowledgement of the fact that classical music is not the only vehicle, and that music on all levels and learning on all levels connects us as individuals, and that we can grow with each other and from each other.
Thank you.
I had a question about positioning, and I was curious about the positioning of these organizations within the community and how you identified where to position yourself and then the projects you undertook. Because one of the things that sort of stuck out at me at that example with Flea, for example, was you said, quote, "We want their identities to be musicians." And it feels to me very much like top down. And I'm curious, as an artist too, I have my own ideas about liberation and whatnot, but what about from the ground up, like when you go into community, how did those people want to be identified? And so I'm just sort of curious about the relationship to, I guess, positioning yourself within the community. Thanks.
Which goes back to the first question about how does that thing called the street, at least in the title of the session, contribute back to influence the music from the bottom up as well as from the top down?
I would say it's a complicated question, obviously, in that the people in the neighborhood probably have as many ways to identify themselves. I mean, more ways than I can imagine. I think for every person it's going to be different. But I think the concept that Community Music Works has followed is sort of locating itself on a main street in this neighborhood, which is under-resourced. It doesn't have a lot of other resources, but thinking of ourselves as a basic neighborhood service, like the barbershop next door, or like the convenience store on the corner, that this is something that you can come in and take advantage of. It's there. It's a service in your community. It's not something we're trying to impose on anybody, but it's something that we think has value and we'd like to share with people who are interested in getting involved. If that answers your question.
I would like to add something. I would say two things. I think in every process of educating, probably per definition, there's one side that knows more than the other and wants to pass that knowledge. And the target group does not necessarily appreciate that knowledge that you want to pass on to them. And I had always an example that inspired me and so far has proved true. The story of Pythagoras, the ancient Greek philosopher who at some point decided to leave the city and live alone in a cave. And he got quite bored being on his own. So he found a young man and said, "Why don't you stay, spend time with me, I will give you money and let me teach you." The young boy thought it was a good deal, so he was spending time with Pythagoras, taking money and learning math about numbers. At some point, Pythagoras wanted to check whether he's really learning and appreciating what he's learning. And he told him, "You know what, I ran out of money. I'm sorry, I cannot teach you anymore." At that point, the young boy said, "Don't worry, I will pay you. Please continue teaching me." And we saw that because when I first came into elementary schools and I offered our music education program, they didn't seem like too eager to do that, or that, okay, we will do that. And we basically were putting the spoon in their mouth. We did everything. We didn't ask them to participate, neither financially nor anything. Just please let us do this work for you. And of course, this cannot continue for too long. And at some point, after a year and a half or two, I said, "Listen, we're running out of money. Either you participate so that we can sustain these programs, or we have to stop." And it was really that point that the partners that really understood the importance of our work stood up and said, "No, we'll talk to the parents, we will try to do everything possible to keep those programs." So in a way, I think when you want to make change in the society, you need to be a little bit aggressive. You need to come and say, "This is important, we want to do it." And hopefully at some point they will understand why and want to continue doing it.
There's a question at the middle top. Or over here, then there. Yeah.
Okay. I have a question about power, and I feel like we've been sort of dancing around power all day. And I think that's central to what you mean about politics in the life of the city. And your example in Silver Lake, I just had a conversation with a friend who grew up in Silver Lake and has recently gone back and is seeing everyone he grew up with displaced by gentrification. And I think that's one kind of power that often follows cultural institutions, is the power of economics and those who have that power. And I don't want us to take us down that path necessarily, but I think, naming that as a specter that's here is that power is being used in these communities all the time. My question is, how do you see these initiatives enfranchising people in the power of the city in ways that they've been excluded in the past?
I'd love to respond to this and start by a response that I had to what Sebastian teed up earlier. And bridging and bonding is something that, at least in my experience, is an easy sell to an arts audience. The fact that the arts can function as a promoter of social cohesion is something that is becoming increasingly well accepted. But then also, social cohesion can be an end in and of itself, or it can be a means to an end. So for example, just to respond to a clear-cut example of politics, there's a project that's going to be kicked off very soon in Cleveland, in the Collinwood neighborhood, where a combination of performances and installations along a route is being leveraged so that One, there's a participatory budgeting element of it where the community is going to determine how an Art Place grant gets spent on creative products, but it's the ballot box project. And they're doing voter registration as a key component of their process. So the goal is not just social cohesion around participatory budgeting, but it's also civic participation. In this case, I often think when a specter like gentrification is brought up, it does us a disservice, because what are we actually talking about? Chances are that there will not be some piece of legislation that ends up becoming an arbiter of where the landed gentry are able to live and not live. But are we talking about economic displacement, physical displacement, cultural displacement? If we look at those as discrete challenges, then I think that we have more of an opportunity to advocate for the specific type of change that might best increase the level of power within that community. In some cases, it might be owning property. In other cases, like in Silver Lake, for example, they redid the signs in a park, but it's only in English. And that sends a clear message. What does that say about power and the expectations for power? And it's not always as I think that we do ourselves a disservice by lumping it all together into one thing when really it's much more complex.
Go ahead. Quickly, you said you didn't want to take us down that path. That's the path that I think is at the heart of this session. Like I said earlier, when we talk about placemaking and city making, I called it politics, but you're talking about power. And one of the discussions about art organizations is that they're not just their footprint geographically, but that their influence will contribute to the systematic displacement of existing communities, which is exactly what gentrification is. Yet, as I think we've heard from the panelists today, it need not, first of all, that's not an inevitable outcome of art organizations, that they will inevitably lead to displacement. It does happen, obviously, of course. It need not be an inevitable outcome, but also that often, for good or for bad, the focus isn't about contributing to profit maximization by landowners, but it's about giving the opportunity, providing a service, which is the art foundation, like the barbershop, providing a service. But that puts in play these mechanisms of displacement. So I think you said, I don't want to go down that path. That's an incredibly important path, and especially important for those people who see themselves, wrongly or rightly, as being displaced because of new forms of cultural production coming into their neighborhood. They may be wrong, but they may be right. But that's a valid critique. And that is exactly what's happening in Silver Lake. Both the perception and the physical displacement of people because of groups who are offering a service, who may not be responsible for the way that their service signals to landowners, for example, that change is coming, and that change spells displacement. The question in the middle at the top?
Hi, thank you all for talking. Yeah, my question is about particularly about like the selection of music. So I mean myself, I played the cello growing up. You know, I listen to classical music every night while I study, so it's a very important part of my life, and I do enjoy it. But I guess the consequences of picking one form of music over another, and I think this is something that's come up before, so my apologies if I'm beating a dead horse per se, but not only the choice of music you pick, the choice of music as it relates to the people in the communities you're working in, and then regarding the fact that you all do run, you know, nonprofits, and so by picking the music you do, there's almost this choice in that. We've picked classical music, AKA we have legitimized, you know, the work we're doing, as if we had picked some other type of music that is maybe more relevant to the communities at play, that wouldn't get, you know, the funding from grantees or whatnot. So just how do you all approach the specific type of music that you pick? And then what do you think the consequences of that are? And then because you've picked a specific type of music and yet you view, you know, your work as being related to civic empowerment and specific geographic, spatiality, how that relates to the ability of that community in question to actually be empowered on 100% their terms, as opposed to part of their terms that's only bolstered by the fact that, the force in question is European art music.
I have a concrete response to that, which is, one reason that we chose classical music is because that's the music that we play, that we are expert in. I wish I could play jazz better, but I really can't. So that's one question. But I think there's a choice we make in the communities that we bring this to, right? But I think it's not that we're saying that classical music should be or is the dominant music in this community. I think we're bringing this art form that we care about. Tell us about the art form you care about. And a concrete example of this is that La Lupita, the taqueria that we did this concert in, was so happy with the results of this fall series that we did that they're renovating their space to create more performance space. They're planning a mariachi series in addition to doing more classical music concerts with community music work. So I think it is empowerment, right? This is one example of a way that you can have music in your space, but we're not saying it's the only one or the best one. We're saying this is something that we care about and we do well, and tell us what you care about and do well.
Yeah, and I at least can respond from a philanthropic perspective. So we've funded Community Music Works, but we also funded an organization in Atlanta called Soul Food Cypher that is partnering with the city of Atlanta to do hip-hop ciphers along transit lines, because it's helping to tackle similar goals to what Community Music Works is. So I just want to throw that out there as an example of the fact that the choice of the genre isn't what, in many cases, is dictating the decisions that get made. Largely, it's about what that genre is accomplishing in terms of the specific community. And if, for whatever reason, someone is thinking that they have something to bring, then I think that, at least in my experience, there is largely an openness, especially now, to non-traditional approaches.
I don't think, at least from my experience, finding funding for classical music is easier than any other. It's probably more difficult at this point. And in our reality, especially today, there's more funding for non-classical music, definitely in Israel. And some people think Arab kids should be playing Arabic music. Why should they play classical music? And in addition to the educational value and the impact that classical music has on the development of the child, it does open a very wide door to be part of more international community. And I always ask myself, why is classical music so important in Japan and in China? But Beethoven didn't write his symphonies in Japan, but it was embraced by those nations, and it became a very important part of who they are. The way I see it, and the way I see the fact that our students are studying today in music schools in Berlin, in New York, and in other places, other genres of music wouldn't have achieved that. And that's important for our community.
This critical conversation, not of politics, but of power, is incredibly important, and everyone up here is so open to talk about it. I suggest you continue that critical conversation during this break, and then rightfully you could put it on hold, at least verbally, while you enjoy the presentation by the Community Music Works, which will follow the break. So don't leave, because the cap of all of this is what you probably all came for.